The courtroom scoffed at the silent wife. Her husband's victory seemed certain, until the judge uttered her hidden last name. In that moment, a billion-dollar legacy awoke, and the true trial of a lifetime began. The air in the courtroom was a precise, refrigerated 70 degrees, but the chill Elena felt was marrow deep. It seeped from the polished Vermont granite floor, climbed the paneled American black walnut walls, and seemed to emanate from the bench itself, where Judge William Harland presided like a monolith carved from legal precedent. This was not just any room in the New York County Supreme Court building, it was a stage for the powerful, and today's performance was a demolition. Elena sat at the petitioner's table, a study in stillness. She was a silhouette against the aggressive vitality of her husband, Leo Thorne. At 38, Leo was the golden boy of Silicon Alley, his name perpetually prefaced by phrases like disruptive visionary and Series D funded. Today he wore the uniform of casual supremacy, a Brunello Cucinelli cashmere sweater, dark jeans, and the palpable energy of a man who believed the world bent to his will. Beside him, his attorney, Robert Vance, was a surgical instrument in a $5,000 suit, his voice a calibrated tool for incision. "Your Honor," Vance began, his tone a masterpiece of respectful gravitas that somehow still managed to condescend. "This proceeding, while undoubtedly painful, is ultimately a simple matter of recognizing foundational contributions. My client, Leo Thorne, built Viridian Dynamics from a concept in a dorm room to a valuation of $900 million. The long hours, the strategic risk, the sheer intellectual capital, these were his alone." Elena listened, her gaze fixed on the grain of the tablewood. She wore a simple, elegant dress of charcoal gray wool, her dark hair pulled into a low chignon. No jewelry, save for a simple platinum band she still wore on her left hand. To the gallery, a handful of reporters, curious legal aides, and a few of Leo's confidently smirking associates, she was a ghost. A beautiful, empty vase about to be officially catalogued and stored away. Vance methodically erected his narrative. He displayed timelines on a screen, highlighting years where Leo was pulling all-nighters in Palo Alto or closing funding rounds in Dubai. Photos showed a younger, brighter-eyed Leo at tech summits, in server rooms, on magazine covers. Elena's image appeared only in the periphery, a blurred figure at a company holiday party, a silent presence in the background of a Hamptons photo. In this curated history, she was set dressing. "Mrs. Thorne," Vance continued, pivoting to her with a semblance of pity, "has of course been provided for. She enjoyed the benefits of my client's success, a luxurious apartment, memberships, travel. But enjoyment is not contribution. A supported lifestyle is not a partnership in enterprise. We will show that her role was, and remained, purely domestic and social." The word domestic hung in the air, dusted with antique disdain. A young associate on Leo's side of the room muffled a laugh. Leo himself took the stand. His confidence was a physical force. He spoke of sacrifice, of the monastic focus required to build an empire. He painted a picture of a wife who preferred spa days to strategy sessions, who couldn't name his lead investors, who viewed his world with a pleasant, bewildered detachment. "I loved her," he said, his voice catching with practiced emotion, "but love doesn't build a company. She was my sanctuary, yes. But a sanctuary is separate from the battlefield." Each word was a gentle brushstroke on a canvas titled "The Burden of Genius." He described her family vaguely as East Coast old money, comfortably retired, implying a passive, faded aristocracy that stood in stark contrast to his own meritocratic hustle. He made her sound like a lovely, fragile heirloom he'd been caring for. Elena's attorney, a middle-aged woman named Susan Carter, offered quiet objections and dutiful cross-examination, but the momentum was a tidal wave. When Susan asked Leo if Elena had ever offered counsel during times of crisis, he smiled sadly. "She'd make tea, Susan. She'd tell me to relax. It was sweet." The gallery rippled with sympathetic understanding for the great man burdened by a kind, simple wife. The proposed settlement was displayed. It was generous by any ordinary standard, a sizable lump sum the apartment, but it was a pittance against the Viridian empire. It was the price one pays for a clean break from a beautiful accessory. Vance called it more than equitable, a recognition of her passive support. Through it all, Elena did not flinch. She did not weep, though the cameras awaited it. She did not glare, though Leo's performance begged for a reactive shot. She simply existed within the storm of words, her hands folded in her lap, her posture impossibly straight. Her stillness was so absolute it became unnerving. The reporters began to scribble adjectives: stoic, resigned, defeated. They misinterpreted the source of her quiet. It was not the numbness of shock, nor the paralysis of fear. It was the profound, unshakable calm of a chess player who has seen 10 moves ahead on a board her opponent doesn't even know exists. Her silence was the quiet of deep water, beneath which currents of immense pressure and history flowed completely unseen. As Leo stepped down from the stand, he passed her table. He didn't look at her, but his posture, the slight tilt of his head, communicated a universe of finality. It was the look of a man closing a subsidiary that no longer served its purpose. The dismantling was nearly complete. The court had heard the story of Leo Thorne, the self-made titan, and the pleasant peripheral woman who shared his name. The facts, as presented, were incontrovertible. Judge Harland shuffled his papers, preparing to move to the dry logistics of asset division. The gallery relaxed, the drama seemingly spent. Elena, the faceless wife, had played her part perfectly. She had been the blank screen upon which Leo's narrative of triumphant struggle was projected. In the modern American theater of success and divorce, she was the final quiet casualty of his ascent. All that remained was for the judge to make it official. But Elena's story, the true one, had not yet begun to speak. It was waiting in the elegant, unassuming script of her full name, typed on a line of a document soon to be read aloud, a name that was not a footnote, but a title all its own. The procedural hum of the courtroom had reached its peak. The digital recorder's red light glowed steadily, a silent witness to the mundane legal transition from dramatic testimony to bureaucratic reckoning. Judge Harland, a man whose face seemed etched with the permanent weariness of presiding over the dissolution of dreams, cleared his throat. He had already heard the story. Another tech mogul, another displaced spouse, another division of assets according to a well-worn calculus of contribution and need. He reached for the next document in the file, the preliminary financial disclosure statement submitted by the respondent, Elena Thorne. A formality. "We will now enter into the record the respondent's sworn financial affidavit," he announced, his voice a dry monotone. He adjusted his tortoise-shell glasses, pulling the paper closer. It was a standard form, filled out in a neat, elegant script that stood in stark contrast to Leo's aggressive, dash-filled handwriting on his own voluminous documents. He began reading, his tone perfunctory, a man ticking boxes. Case number 2024-11477, Thorne vs. Thorne. Respondent, Elena Marie. He paused. Not a dramatic stop, but the slight hitch of a reader encountering an unexpected syllable. His eyes, previously skimming the page, now focused. He leaned forward an inch. The gallery, lulled into a stupor by the legal tedium, barely noticed. Leo was whispering something to Robert Vance. A slight, victorious curve still on his lips. Vance nodded, already mentally packing his briefcase. One of the reporters in the back row stifled a yawn. Judge Harland continued, but the timbre of his voice changed. It lost its automated quality and gained a weight, a conscious enunciation. Elena Marie. Thorne Cartwright. The name, in its full hyphenless double barrel, landed in the quiet room not with a shout, but with the profound, deafening impact of a stone dropped into a still pond. Thorne Cartwright. For a heartbeat, there was perfect, incomprehensible silence. Then, the air itself seemed to crackle and change pressure. It was as if the central heating had cut out, replaced by an Arctic downdraft. The whisper of paper from the court clerk ceased. The reporter's yawn died mid-breath, her jaw slackening. Leo's head snapped toward the bench as if pulled by a wire. His smirk didn't just vanish, it was erased, leaving behind a blank slate of pure primal confusion. His brain, so finely tuned for market shifts and code, attempted to process the two words. Thorne was his. Cartwright was an echo. A distant, powerful echo from a world he aspired to but could never truly penetrate. Robert Vance was the first on his side of the room to fully comprehend. The blood drained from his face, leaving his carefully curated tan looking sallow and sickly. His fingers, which had been drumming a confident rhythm on the legal pad, froze. He knew. Every corporate lawyer in Manhattan knew. Cartwright. It wasn't just old money. It was the old money, the kind that built banks before the term fintech was invented, the kind that owned chunks of Manhattan so foundational they weren't listed on portfolios, they were etched into the city's deed history. The Cartwrights of Cartwright and Sterling, the white shoe law firm that represented nations. The Cartwrights of the Cartwright Foundation, whose philanthropic moves could sway elections. The Cartwrights whose name was whispered in boardrooms not for flashy takeovers, but for the silent immovable power of legacy equity and generational influence. A low, incredulous murmur erupted from the gallery, then died just as quickly, stifled by a collective intake of breath. All eyes swiveled from the judge to Elena. She had not moved. She still sat with her hands folded, her back straight. But the light in the room seemed to have shifted, pooling around her now. Her stillness was no longer that of a defendant awaiting sentence. It was the impenetrable calm of a sovereign observing subjects. The simple grey dress now looked less like a concession and more like a uniform of understated authority. The absence of jewelry was no longer a sign of lack, but a statement. She needed no adornment. The name was adornment enough. Judge Harland slowly lowered the paper. He looked over his glasses, not at Vance, not at Leo, but directly at Elena. His entire demeanor had undergone a seismic shift. The weary bureaucrat was gone. In his place was a man suddenly, acutely aware of standing at a historical and professional crossroads. His voice, when he spoke again, was careful, measured, and carried a new profound respect. The court, he said, each word deliberate, notes the respondent's full legal name. Elena Marie Torne Cartwright. He said it again, letting the compound name resonate, making it indisputably part of the official record. Counsel for the petitioner, he continued, turning to Vance, are you and your client fully aware of the respondent's familial lineage and its potential bearing on the marital estate, both direct and contingent? The question was a legal missile wrapped in velvet. Vance stood, his usual eloquence reduced to ash. Your Honor, we were operating under the understanding that... The understanding, Judge Harland interrupted, not unkindly but with immense force, appears to be incomplete. Significantly so. He turned his gaze to Leo, who looked like a man who had just seen the ground open up beneath his Gucci loafers. The self-made narrative, his entire identity, was crumbling into a pathetic fiction. He hadn't married a simple, supportive wife. He had married, and was now attempting to publicly cast off, a Cartwright. The judge picked up his gavel, not to strike it, but to hold it, a symbol of the authority he now understood was shared, in a way, with a quiet woman at the table. Given the substantial new context introduced into these proceedings, the court is compelled to reconsider the scope of discovery. This is no longer merely a dissolution of a marriage between two individuals. This appears to involve the disentanglement of a prominent familial trust from a privately held enterprise. He took a deep breath. We are adjourned for 2 hours. I strongly advise both parties to confer with counsel. When we reconvene, we will begin again, with a fresh understanding of the landscape. The gavel fell with a soft, definitive tap. The spell broke into a chaos of hushed, frantic noise. Reporters scrambled for the doors, phones already pressed to ears. Leo's associates huddled around him, their faces masks of panic. Vance was already hissing into his phone, get me everything on the Cartwright Intervivos trusts, the holding companies, everything now. And through the maelstrom, Elena Thorne Cartwright finally rose. She smoothed the front of her dress, a small, deliberate motion. She then turned, not to her frantic husband, but to meet the gaze of the reporters. For the first time that day, a faint, knowing smile touched her lips, not of triumph, but of simple, absolute acknowledgement. The mask was off. The facade of the powerless wife had dissolved, revealing the formidable architecture beneath. She had not spoken a single word. Yet, with the mere pronunciation of her name, she had not just changed the case. Appears to be incomplete. Significantly so. He turned his gaze to Leo, who looked like a man who had just seen the ground open up beneath his Gucci loafers. The self-made narrative, his entire identity, was crumbling into a pathetic fiction. He hadn't married a simple, supportive wife. He had married, and was now attempting to publicly cast off, a Cartwright. The judge picked up his gavel, not to strike it, but to hold it, a symbol of the authority he now understood was shared, in a way, with a quiet woman at the table. Given the substantial new context introduced into these proceedings, the court is compelled to reconsider the scope of discovery. This is no longer merely a dissolution of a marriage between two individuals. This appears to involve the disentanglement of a prominent familial trust from a privately held enterprise. He took a deep breath. We are adjourned for 2 hours. I strongly advise both parties to confer with counsel. When we reconvene, we will begin again, with a fresh understanding of the landscape. The gavel fell with a soft, definitive tap. The spell broke into a chaos of hushed, frantic noise. Reporters scrambled for the doors, phones already pressed to ears. Leo's associates huddled around him, their faces masks of panic. Vance was already hissing into his phone, "Get me everything on the Cartwright Intervivos trusts, the holding companies, everything now." And through the maelstrom, Elena Thorne Cartwright finally rose. She smoothed the front of her dress, a small, deliberate motion. She then turned, not to her frantic husband, but to meet the gaze of the reporters. For the first time that day, a faint, knowing smile touched her lips, not of triumph, but of simple, absolute acknowledgement. The mask was off. The facade of the powerless wife had dissolved, revealing the formidable architecture beneath. She had not spoken a single word. Yet, with the mere pronunciation of her name, she had not just changed the case. She had rewritten the entire story. The real power in the room had just announced itself, and it was time for the reckoning to begin. The 2-hour recess was not a pause, it was a pressure cooker. The sleek corridors of the courthouse, usually echoing with the dry murmur of legalese, thrummed with a frantic, almost violent energy. Leo Thorne's world had not just shifted, it had inverted. Huddled in a private conference room that now felt like a holding cell, he watched Robert Vance pace like a caged animal, the attorney's phone pressed to his ear as he received a rapid-fire education in Cartwright family law. No, not the trust, the irrevocable trust established in '82. The one with the springing power of appointment tied to lineal descent. Vance pinched the bridge of his nose, his eyes closed in pain. Yes, which would mean any asset commingled with marital property could be subject to a clawback. No, we don't know what was commingled because we didn't know to ask. With each clipped phrase, Leo felt a piece of his empire dissolve. Viridian Dynamics, his $900 million masterpiece, was suddenly a fragile web of potential liabilities. Had Cartwright Capital, however indirectly, seeded the early rounds? Did their legal umbrella shield his first precarious patents? The monastic focus of his early years now looked like the sheltered incubation of a project bankrolled and protected by a dynasty he'd been too arrogant to fully see. Across the hall, in another conference room, the atmosphere was one of serene, mobilized authority. Elena stood by the window, looking down at the flow of traffic on Center Street. Susan Carter, her attorney, was no longer the quiet defender. She was a general receiving dispatches. "The Cartwright and Sterling managing partner is on standby," Susan said, glancing at her tablet. "The forensic accountants from Kepler Marx are pulling the complete tapestry of both your separate holdings and the marital estate. They'll be ready to present a preliminary map of asset provenance before we reconvene." She looked at Elena, a newfound awe in her eyes. "You could have led with this." Elena turned from the window. Her calm was unnerving, not because it was vacant, but because it was so full. "Where would the lesson have been in that, Susan?" she asked, her voice still soft, yet now layered with a lifetime of observing from a position of unassailable strength. "He built a narrative on the assumption of my emptiness. It had to be complete for him to believe it. For the world to believe it. Now, they all get to witness its demolition." When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was funereal. The gallery was packed, the air thick with the scent of anticipation and expensive perfume. Judge Harland entered, his expression no longer weary but intensely focused, the look of a historian about to document a seismic event. "Counsel," he began, directing his words to Vance. "Has the petitioner had sufficient opportunity to reassess his position in light of the court's clarified understanding?" Vance stood, the picture of a man who had aged a decade in 2 hours. Your Honor, given the profound and previously undisclosed complexities introduced by the respondent's familial affiliations, we must respectfully request a continuance. Months, at least, to undertake the necessary forensic discovery. From the respondent's table, Susan Cotter rose. Your Honor, we object. The respondent's name has never been a secret. It is on her birth certificate, her marriage license, and every legal document she has ever signed. The petitioner's failure of due diligence is not grounds for delay. In fact, she continued, placing a hand on a slim, freshly delivered dossier, to expedite this process and in the spirit of full transparency the petitioner claimed to value, we are prepared to provide the court with a preliminary summary of the Cartwright family trusts and their absolute, legally firewalled separation from the marital community property. She approached the bench and handed the dossier to the clerk. It was not a stack of papers, it was a bound volume, its cover embossed with a discreet crest. Judge Harland accepted it as one might a state document. This was the true reckoning. It was not about taking from Leo, it was about revealing what was never his to claim. Susan's associate activated the screen. What appeared was not a timeline of Leo's genius, but an elegant multi-generational flowchart of holdings, trusts, and foundations. It was a map of quiet, monumental power. A harbor in the Caymans established before Leo was born. A portfolio of Manhattan real estate held in a perpetual trust for which Elena was the lifetime beneficiary, not an owner, an income stream as steady and untouchable as a river. The famed Cartwright collection of post-war art, valued in the high 9 figures, held by a museum foundation. As the summary shows, Susan said, her voice clear and cool, my client's economic reality is, and has always been, wholly independent of Mr. Thorne's ventures. His characterization of her as a dependent is not only insulting but demonstrably false. Her choice to live modestly within their marriage was precisely that, a choice, not a limitation. She then pivoted, her gaze sharpening. However, the petitioner's characterization of his own enterprise as a solitary Herculean effort requires examination. We are prepared to present evidence that Viridian Dynamics' first major liability shield was provided through the Cartwright and Sterling Pro Bono Incubator Program, a connection facilitated by my client's discreet recommendation. We will show that the career-altering introduction to Sequoia Capital was made by her uncle, Thomas Cartwright. My client's contribution was not domestic, it was foundational. It was the silent application of a privilege Mr. Thorne eagerly consumed while publicly dismissing its source. Leo looked as if he'd been physically struck. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his origin story. He hadn't been a self-made man, he'd been a favored project. Judge Harland absorbed it all. Finally, he spoke. The court finds that the respondent's financial position is entirely separate. The proposed settlement is not only inequitable, it is irrelevant. The true matter before this court is the accurate valuation of the marital estate, which now clearly includes the value added to the petitioner's separate property through the respondent's unique social and familial capital, a capital he deliberately obscured and derided. He turned his gaze to Leo. Mr. Thorne, you sought a divorce based on a narrative of singular creation. The evidence now suggests you were not the sole architect, but the most visible beneficiary, of a consortium you failed to acknowledge. This court will now determine a true and equitable division based on that reality. The gavel fell, its crack final. In the stunned silence that followed, Elena finally moved. She stood, collected her coat, and walked toward the doors. As she passed Leo's table, she stopped. For the first time that day, she looked directly at him. Her eyes held no anger, no gloating. They held only the cool, clear certainty of a woman who had never needed him to define her worth, only to reveal his own lack of it. You wanted the empire, Leo, she said, her voice so only he could hear. You just never understood that I was never part of it. I was the landscape it was built upon. And landscapes can be reclaimed. She walked out, leaving not just a courtroom, but the shattered myth of a self-made man in her wake. The real trial was indeed over. The verdict, written in a name and a legacy, was absolute. The fallen rose had not been crushed, she had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal the formidable ancient vine from which she grew. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more stories from courtroom drama.